second lecture for Unit 5, Land and Water Use, will involve two PowerPoints, 5.11 and I believe 5.12. 5.11 is all about the concept of ecological footprint. What you need to do is be able to explain the variables measured in an ecological footprint and use that data to illustrate some environmental issue. So an ecological footprint is a measure of how much a person or a group consumes, and it is expressed by how much land would be required for this use. So for example, the footprint would involve how much energy is used for production of energy, where you live, timber and paper for you, food and fibers, seafood, fisheries, which would be fisheries, cropland, forest, built-up land, and carbon, which would be also the carbon footprint. Factors that the land is required for would be food production, raw materials such as wood, metal, and plastic, housing, electricity, which would involve the mining of coal, natural gas, the production of solar and wind power, etc. Well, how much land is required for disposal of the waste? Ecological footprint versus carbon footprint. With the ecological, it's measured in land, such as something called the global hectare, which is about 2.47 acres or about 2.5 football fields. A carbon footprint is measured in tons of CO2 produced each year. So for example, your ecological footprint may be 2.6 global hectares. Your carbon footprint may be 4.2 tons of carbon, or 55% of your ecological footprint. All CO2 released from an individual or group's consumptions or activities, material goods, food production, energy use, all of these are involved in carbon footprint. Factors that affect the footprint would be, how would you increase it? If you're wealthy, you're going to have a larger footprint than if you're not. Why? Because you have larger homes, you travel more, you fly more resource needed. Instead of one bicycle, you need 5 or 6 cars. How much meat you eat, what type of meat you eat. Why? Because meat consumption requires more land, more water, more energy. Fossil fuel usage. How much do you need for your car, for heating your home, for electricity, for making plastic? So how do you decrease your footprint? Use renewable energy. Use public transit. There are places in the world that it's much faster. For example, several years ago, I was going from the sports center in downtown LA to on the Gold Line back to Pasadena. Now, the Gold Line was going to take me 45 minutes. I was given a ride during rush hour, and it took us an hour and a half. Not only did it take more gas, but it took more time. Eating a plant-based diet because, with the 10% rule, you need 10% less energy. Less consumption, less travel, less energy use. So if the whole world lived like us, the ecological footprint would be in the number of Earths required to consume at the same level as us. So the current average U.S. footprint is 5.1 Earths. In other words, to produce all the food needed, it would take, if everyone on the planet lived the way we did, it'd take 5 worlds to supply us. Global footprint is 1.85, meaning each year all of humanity uses 1.85 times what we can produce. So a practice FRQ might be describe one factor that accounts for the difference in carbon footprint between United States at the top and Uganda towards the bottom. Explain one environmental consequence of this factor. For the second topic, 5.12, it's about sustainability. What we will learn is about the concept of sustainability and be able to analyze data that illustrates environmental issues. So sustainability is consuming a resource or using a space in a way that does not deplete or degrade it. In other words, we can use it for thousands and thousands of years. For example, using compost over synthetic fertilizer, using compost from cattle over using synthetic, which requires fossil fuels. The maximum sustainable yield would be the maximum amount of renewable resource that can be harvested without depleting the resource for future use. In other words, cutting down too many trees makes it so that more trees will not survive because they're not shading, there's not seeds and so forth. Roughly half the carrying capacity maximizes yield and regeneration rate of the population. So if you've got a population size and it's growing, if you have the fastest growth, that's where you want to harvest it. That way you maximize the sustainable yield, as you can see in the chart. Okay, environmental indicators of sustainability, factors that help us determine the health of the environment and making sure that the earth continues to survive. So, such as biodiversity, making sure that the genetics, species number, and ecosystem diversity stays high. The higher the biodiversity, the healthier the ecosystems. If the biodiversity decreases, it can indicate there's too much pollution, we're destroying too much of their land. Climate is changing the temperature so that, if the temperature rises too much, trees cannot get up and move farther north, so they die. Global extinction rate is a strong environmental indicator since species extinction decreases the species richness of the earth. So if we look, since 1500, there's been a rapidly increase in the number of species that are going extinct. Amphibians is way up there, followed by mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish. Background at the bottom is what it should be. It's just natural, but we're causing it. Food production sometimes does that. It indicates the ability of Earth's soil, water, and climate to support agriculture. Major threats to food production are climate change, soil degradation. For example, if you dry it out too much, desertification, where we get too much erosion, where the soil takes hundreds of years to produce, and we lose it in 1 or 2 years, we lose too much groundwater. And we can see on here where there's places where there's going to be drastic effect of agriculture. If the global climate change creates, right through here is a huge change. Basically, right through the equator, as it gets too hot, we're going to have drastic problems with agriculture. Increasing meat consumption puts a strain on food production because of all the energy needed to grow the crops, harvest the crops, so that we can use those crops that we could eat to feed the cattle. Global grain production per capita has leveled off and shown signs of decline recently. So atmospheric temperature and CO2. Life on Earth depends on a very narrow temperature range. CO2 is a global greenhouse gas. It traps radiation and warms the Earth. All the energy comes down, and through time it goes from visible, and when it's absorbed by Earth, it was reflected as infrared. With more CO2, it keeps on coming back more and more times. It's like having too many blankets on you. And you can see since the 1780, the amount of CO2, since the Industrial Revolution in 1780, the amount of CO2 has gone up about 25%. Deforestation causes a loss of CO2 removal or CO2 sequestration. And combustion of forests cause the release of CO2. Increasing CO2 makes it so that the lands becomes too dry. It destroys habitats. It makes storms more intense. Human population resource depletion. As human population grows, the resource depletion grows. So you can see in here, since 1780, there's been a huge increase in the human populations. Resources are harvested unsustainably and decrease the ecosystem health because there's too many humans. Why? Because we need more paper, which leads to deforestation. We need more food, which leads to soil erosion, deforestation, groundwater depletion. We travel more, not just by walking, but bikes, cars, planes. Leads to air, water, and soil pollution. And we need all that land for the roads, all that land for the airports, all the land for all these. That leads to destruction of the habitats of organisms. And we can see that the population has been going up. And as it goes up, deforestation has been going up also. So the practice FRQ 5.12 is, if you look at that data, can you explain which student most likely lives in a highly developed country? Student 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you describe one of the 4 categories of ecological footprint that can serve, how can those categories serve as an environmental indicator as to whether it's sustainable or not?